Hello, my name is Sarah Sheridan and I am a writer and an activist. And I'm going to talk to you today about why it's important that we memorialise the accused witches, um, and particularly with reference to how we might do that in Scotland. I'm sure you all know all the stories about the accused witches, and the great work that's been done by the University of Edinburgh in tracking down from the records exactly which women were accused and how those trials went. Really, a lot of the statistics are very shocking. It was very much something that did affect women more than men, to the tune of about 84%, I think. And also that 16% of where men were involved was only where you got these clusters of accusation, because people were being tortured and they were just generally just naming people like crazy. You do get men named in those situations, but not more generally in witch trials that happen sort of individually. And I think that's quite interesting, because it was something that clearly in the mind of the people who were doing the accusing was something that was much more associated with women than with men. It's only when you get this kind of panic going on that suddenly they're saying, oh yeah, the men as well, everybody, any name that we can kind of think of. About 2 years ago, I wrote a book called Where Are the Women? And the premise of Where Are the Women was that I re-landscaped Scotland. And I took all the street names and statues and monuments that are put up to men, and most of our monuments in Scotland, really like the rest of the Western world, have been raised to men rather than women. And I rededicated them to women's lives. And in the book, I put up 1,200 monuments to Scottish women who had achieved really very extraordinary things, and also some very ordinary women who were really valued by their communities, women like the tea lady at a football club who was very greatly loved, or a cleaning lady at a university, or a midwife in a rural community, women who really had an impact on the people around them. And among the women that I memorialised in the book were very many witches, and also I created in the book a national monument to witches. And in the book I imagined, and it is just imaginary although it is a real site, a burnt out church in the middle of the countryside. And I worked with an amazing perfumer who called Alex Musgrave, who has a blog called The Silver Fox, and he helped me to imagine lining the walls of this ruined church, which is burnt out, with herbs, and that the herbs would scent the air along with the charred out wood of the church, and that this would become a fitting memorial, fitting place to remember the deaths of these women. We're not very good at remembering either women's achievement or women's struggles. UK-wide, probably around 15% of monuments are raised to women, and way by far most of those monuments are raised to Queen Victoria, because Queen Victoria loved a statue. And indeed, having streets and things named after her. And so there was a great vogue during her reign to dedicate things to Victoria, because basically to suck up to her. And so after Victoria, the next most commemorated female character in the UK is actually Wendy from Peter Pan, who is of course a totally fictional character. And so when it comes to actual real women who contributed to our history, to where we come from, to our society, to our culture, they are way down the line. And although we have a few buildings and a few statues and monuments and a few street names and things, really, it's a very, very small part of how we remember women within our built landscape and our natural landscape. And the reason I wrote the book was to highlight that, was to say, why are we memorialising largely heteronormative or white middle class and upper class men? That's what our built language reflects. And of course, that has a massive impact. It has a bigger impact than you might think. Because as a young woman growing up in the city I grew up in Edinburgh, and wandering around, there are really very, very few statues to women. And so you understand that, whatever you achieve, you will not be memorialised, you will not be remembered, that achievement will not be honoured. And around me, particularly in the city centre in Edinburgh, where there are a lot of statues and monuments, are, hundreds of those to men who have achieved things, some of whom, frankly, don't really deserve statues. Or the kind of that kind of memorialisation. So while I think it's important that we remember both the good and the bad in our history, the putting up of statues and the naming of streets tends to be because we want to commemorate the good things that person does. It's an honour. And men are honoured in our society in that way, way, way more than women. And so for me, it's really important for young women growing up to see the world around them reflecting that achievement and reflecting our real history, because the reality is that women did achieve great things and also, like the witches, suffer great things. So my case is very much for individual monuments to women, but also to groups of women. And those groups of women were mixed between women who you might think of as victims, like the witches, or women who campaigned, like on Red Clydeside, the rent strikers, or achieved something collectively, like the women of the Scottish Women's Hospitals who saved thousands of lives during World War One, and go largely uncommemorated, apart from a plaque actually on St Andrew's Square in Edinburgh, which is where their headquarters were. So in terms of commemorating groups of women, and particularly victims, I suppose the analogy I would draw when making a case for the witches is looking at monuments to male victims. And we have a massive amount of monuments to male victims because we have war memorials. We have war memorials all across our country, and practically every village has a memorial to the men who died, and particularly if those memorials are for World War One. They, generally speaking, don't even include the women's names, and that includes women who were perhaps nurses who enlisted alongside their brothers. These are brothers and sisters going to war side by side. The men go to fight, the women go to join the Scottish Women's Hospital or the Red Cross, which contribute in that way. And if the man dies, even in training, he will be on the monument, and the women die or are killed during the course of their duties. They don't go on the monument. And that changes a little bit during World War II. We do have some women who are memorialised on some monuments during World War II, but largely it's these monuments are monuments to male heroism and male victimhood. And I would draw that analogy with the witches and say it's really important that we recognise that these women were victims of the state and the church, actually, which at the time of the witchcraft trials were not entirely separate endeavours, and that their contribution, if you like, and what happened to them is really important to us. It's part of our history and it's part of our memory. And because during that era, witchcraft was considered something that was, it's almost part of the family. So if you were accused of being a witch, your mother or your daughters or even your nieces and cousins and things might also be accused. So it was something that really struck terror into whole groups of women, family groups of women. And it affected the way those women thought and behaved, really beyond, I think, the couple of hundred years that the witch trials were going on. And we have to remember, the last woman that was prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act was in 1942, and she, in Scotland, and she was a spiritualist, and apparently, they say, she foresaw a ship that had gone down, and told I think a mother that her son had died on the ship going down before that news was announced, before that news was released. And the War Office was really unhappy about this. They didn't want public morale being affected in this way, and this woman was sent to prison under the Witchcraft Act. So it's not so very distant. But it's not only important that we memorialise the witches, I think, within Scotland, because witchcraft is not something that you can be accused of or sent to prison for or tortured for or killed for in this country anymore. But certainly, for example, in Africa and in some places in India, women are still suffering, and it is largely women still suffering for these crimes. So the idea of a pardon and a memorial is a really important thing to do on the international stage as well, to strengthen the case, strengthen the movement against these kind of prosecutions, convictions, and sort of state murders, really, in other countries. So it's part of Scotland's international obligation, I would say. And because we had among the worst witchcraft trials in Europe, so some of the German states also had very terrible trials, but in Scotland we really, we're up there among the worst. I think it falls to us really to remember that and to memorialise that and to recognise what went wrong, I suppose. And so that would be the case that I would make, certainly, for the campaign that Claire Mitchell QC has launched, and which I, for one, fully support. And I hope that, I think we have, in Scotland still, particularly women, this sort of emotional connection to the witches and what it must be like to be accused in that way, because particularly if you're a poor woman, if you were a richer woman, you were one of those 6% of witches who came from the upper classes, you had a chance because you had money and you could get a lawyer and you could take your case out of the church court and into or from away from your local church and into the High Court in Edinburgh. And of those cases that were prosecuted at the High Court with male lawyers, because all lawyers were men, boo, in this era, you had a chance of getting off. You had about a 50%, it was sort of half and half chance of getting off. If you were a poor woman, you had no chance at all. Your best chance was to escape. And there are, happily, some cases of accused witches who do appear to have managed to get away, but they're few and far between. And so I think there is this sense of, what would I do if you were in this situation? What would you do, and how you would feel being accused of these things? And I think there is also an interesting parallel there with the lives that some of us lead online, where we are quite often attacked for some of our views, sometimes for being a feminist. Certainly I know I've had, people come back to me and send what's effectively hate mail online, or sometimes we get hate mail in the office because of the stance that we may have taken on certain issues. And I think the witches resonate because of that. It is part of our culture still to blame women. And you see that often in rape trials. The focus is very much on what a woman was wearing or how this could possibly be her fault, rather than, well, why did this man take this action? Why did this man break the law and do this offence? And so some of the cultural resonance of the witches is still with us. And in fact, in that sense, we kind of all are witches. We're all out there and could be put in a position where we would be accused or judged. And so that's another reason, I think, why this resonates so strongly with women, and particularly with Scottish women, because, we did have the worst witch trials. Thank you for listening to my chit-chat about witches and the way women are treated in public life, and why we need more memorials, not only to individual women, but also to groups of women. I hope that it has inspired you to get involved in the Witches Accused campaign. Even if all you do is post online or make a small donation, everything helps. And I hope not too far away to see an amazing monument to these women and to their memory, and one that will truly resonate both within Scotland and internationally. Thank you.